Club's Forum Committee and producer of today's forum. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people work together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live and explore. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of Oregonians via X-Ray FM radio stations, KGW's website, Facebook feed and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. In addition to the City Club's valued media partners, our corporate sponsors enable us to continue to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's winter sponsor, Portland General Electric, and thank them for their generous support. Please join me in showing our appreciation to the donors, staff, and volunteers who have made this event possible. Today, we're here to discuss the challenges faced by working families and children, as well as opportunities to ensure more children get the right start they deserve. As a working mom with twins in daycare, the questions we'll explore today are on my mind a lot. I'm struck by the impossible choices many parents have to make in order to just make ends meet and meet the most basic needs of their kids. So today we're going to talk about what we can do to do better by Oregon's kids and by Oregon's families. And we're going to hear from 4 women who know what that takes. Andrea Peluso is the co-founder and executive director of Family Forward Oregon and Family Forward Action. Her nonprofits work to advance economic justice for mothers and caregivers. Ms. Peluso has a master's degree from Columbia University in social work and public health. In 2015, she was a recipient of President Obama's Champion of Change for Working Families Award. Carmen Rubio is the executive director of Latino Network, where she and her team work to advance the Latino community in education, leadership, and civic engagement in Oregon. She currently serves on the boards of All Hands Raised, University of Oregon Alumni Association, and Social Venture Partners Portland. She also serves as a member of the State of Oregon's Higher Education Coordinating Commission and the Pioneer Courthouse Square Board of Trustees. She earned a BA in political science from the University of Oregon and completed 2 years of graduate studies at the University of Washington School of Communications. In 2015, she earned a certificate from the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. And earlier this year, she was named by Portland Business Journal as a Woman of Influence. And Donna Schnitker is the president and director at large for the Oregon Head Start Association. Ms. Schnitker has been working in the early childhood field for over 35 years, the last 24 as Head Start director. She has a master's degree in early intervention, early childhood special education, and an administrator's license from TSPC. She has served as the Public Information Committee Chair for the past 23 years and has served on several committees in Salem representing the Oregon Head Start Association. Most recently, she was appointed to the Early Learning Council. Moderating our discussion today is Rahi Reddy, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager at Metro. Ms. Reddy has been a community leader, policy advocate, and educator for more than 20 years. As a faculty member at the University of Oregon's Labor and Education Research Center, Ms. Reddy led research and examined the growing prevalence of low-wage sector jobs under an initiative called Equity in the Economy. Before that, she served as chief of staff for an 85,000-member union representing employees in Southern California, helping transform the union's mission and priorities. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
For our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Rahi Reddy, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Director at Metro. With me today are Andrea Peluso, co-founder and executive director of Family Forward Oregon and Family Forward Action, Carmen Rubio, executive director of Latino Network, and Donna Schnitker, president and director at large at the Oregon Head Start Association. So I first wanted to just start off to set the context of the kind of complex conversation that we're going to have today. So in Oregon, 80% of parents with children under the age of 18 are in the labor force. And that's probably undercounting. That's not counting undocumented immigrants, many of whom who are working parents and others. And as a working parent, many of you know all too well that childcare and early childhood education comes with costs, not just the cost of care, but also the costs of loss of wages if you can't afford to pay for care because costs are rising, the costs of increased stress and pressure as these costs rise alongside housing and food bills and other costs that are going up for working families while wages are not. And the cost of not being able to provide your child access to the highest quality of early childhood opportunities to give them a leg up as they enter the K through 12 system. So the increased need for care and the lack of resources create gaps. In one statistic, children in the US, children aged 5 to 14 take care of themselves regularly during the week for an average of 5 hours a week. And in Oregon, only 16% of Oregonian children eligible for childcare subsidies are actually served. And if you're one of the 14,000 childcare or early childhood workers and preschool teachers in Oregon, you know that the challenges of doing the work you love that enriches our children's lives comes at a cost as well. Childcare workers earn a median hourly wage of $10.90 an hour. And preschool teachers helping prepare our children for success in kindergarten and beyond earn a median hourly wage of $13.50. Earnings are so low that these workers are 2 times likely the average of other workers to qualify for public assistance and other family supports. And additionally, our punitive immigration policies, including an escalation of deportations, are usually not discussed in terms of caregiving and the impacts to children, but they're having a detrimental impact on health and resiliency of families and caregiving, making more children more vulnerable as they lose family caregivers who know and love them, and having those stress and impacts impacting them in school. So these are just some of the broad scope of issues that we are really weaving together today with our excellent set of panelists. So linking families, care providers, and policies to understand what does it take to invest in the success of our kids and our families in Oregon. So first I wanted to have us start off with our panelists here and really to ask the question for you to introduce yourselves and to ask the question of what is it the work that you do and how is that work really helping to fill these gaps that we've outlined?
All right. Thank you so much for that great introduction and for inviting me to be here today. As was said, I am the Executive Director of Family Forward Oregon and Family Forward Action, that are 2 related organizations that really work to center caregiving and caregivers and to really understand better why caregiving in this country is such a predictor of economic insecurity and of poverty. And we really think that has a long history in this country, where caregiving has really relied on the exploited, no-pay or low-pay work of women, and disproportionately of women of color. And for us, this comes from really looking at caregiving, really at the center of systems that are designed to produce really disparate incomes by race, by gender, by class. So, and yet, caregiving is such an essential part of a functioning economy. Most people can't work unless they have someone available to help take care of their family. So all of us being able to participate in our broader economy at some point relies on caregiving. And it's universal. We all have families. We all have families with needs, and yet our work structures, the supports that we build around our families aren't really designed for that universal experience. It's often really invisible. Caregiving is something that's happening in private settings, it's happening in our homes, it's happening in care facilities, it's happening sort of out of the public eye. It's something you're not aware of unless you need it or you provide it. And yet it's so universal to our human experience and our family experience. So we're looking at that. And what would it take to build different structures, to build an economy that valued caregivers? What would have to change for that to be true? And what impact would that have on mothers, on our elders, on people living with disabilities, on the women who work in care fields at the very low rates of pay that Rahi mentioned? We see it as a real problem that in this country, motherhood is a predictor of poverty. Being a mother predicts poverty. And we think there are some really immediate things we can do to address that, and then there are some really kind of more systemic and harder things that we really need to think about. So to answer a little bit more specifically the question about how our work relates to early childhood, I would say first, we really come from the place that helping mothers helps kids, and that we have to do that actually to help kids in a really sustainable way that impacts their whole lives. And we have a couple of different near-term objectives that we're working on, and one of those is to establish a statewide program for paid family and medical leave. And obviously that program should incorporate ways to cover someone's wages when they're sick themselves or caring for other family members, but it also really centers that first experience of bringing a child into your family, whether that's through birth or adoption or through foster care, and really making sure that we're creating the time for that, a priority for that, that we're not adding economic stress to that time of your life that should be about giving our kids the very, very best beginning. And then the other thing that we're really thinking a lot about is how we invest in childcare and in supporting childcare in a much more comprehensive way than we ever have as a country. We see childcare absolutely as a market failure. It is a place where the costs of childcare exceed what most families can afford, and the women, because it's predominantly women who work in childcare, are making poverty-level wages. And there is actually no way out of that except public spending on childcare. That is the answer. We can debate it, we can wait a long time to develop the political will, but the answer is public dollars being invested in this system. We're in a crisis around need, around availability, around cost, around working conditions, and to address that, we're going to need to make a collective investment.
Carmen Rubio, Executive Director of Latino Network.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to be here today. Very excited to do so. So when we were first thinking about the questions that we would be talking about, what was helpful as a prompt question, we came up with what would make Oregon a great place to raise a kid or to be a kid. And so I really thought about that, and really for me, I think that a great place would mean that every child has an opportunity for a great start. Supportive families, stable housing, access to healthy food, but also early childhood learning programs are really, really important. This gives children their best chance for a strong start and a strong educational life. And our goal should be to close the opportunity gap for all children, but especially the most historically underserved, which are children of color in Oregon. To improve educational outcomes, our state and elected leaders really need to do more to increase access to high-quality early learning opportunities for children of color. And this is crucial not just to student success, but our future as a state of Oregon. This is the future workforce that we're talking about here. Right now, 75% of low-income children in Oregon don't have access to high-quality early learning programs. And we know that 90% of brain development actually happens between birth and 5 years old. Together, this means that we can't afford as a state to not invest upfront in these pivotal early years. The Oregon Department of Education released a report in February that confirmed two things that we already know. First, children of color are facing greater disparities in kindergarten readiness. And then second, that there's a high correlation of kindergarten readiness with literacy and math performance on third grade assessments. So by not investing early, we're leaving kids behind before they even start in school. So our leaders, our lawmakers, if they're truly committed to improving graduation rates and closing the opportunity gap, we need their leadership to ensure investment in these programs. We need these things to happen now and soon. And there are some bright spots across the state. We have several well-established, culturally specific early learning childhood programs across Oregon that are achieving strong outcomes for kids of color. For example, I'll talk about ours. Juntos Aprendemos, in English it's Together We Learn. We're preparing children for kindergarten with a program that is in their home language. and grounded in their own culture. And this also includes skill building for parents to empower them to be their children's first teacher and strongest advocate. So programs like ours, there are several others across the state, are effective because they're designed by and for the communities to meet cultural and linguistic needs of these families. And there's a lot of urgency, and so a lot of our work intersects with policy, it intersects with childcare and family needs and supports to ensure that our kids have the healthiest and best start in life.
Thank you. Donna Schnicker, President and Director at Large at the Oregon Head Start Association.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Excuse me. I have been part of Head Start for a very long time. One of the unique things about, I guess, me is that I live in Burns, Oregon, which is out in the desert in the frontier part of the state. So I have an opportunity to bring to the table some of the views of the rural part of the state and some of the lacks that we have there that aren't available here in the metro area. Head Start serves children and families that are 100% of poverty and below. And in some rare cases, if you have achieved saturation with 100%, you can go up to 130% of poverty. That's not very much money. And without Head Start, which is free to the family, those children would not have access to preschool at all. The reason that that is important is that kindergarten now is what first grade used to be about 6 years ago. If you do not have a very strong foundation before you enter kindergarten, you will fail. And catching up sometimes happens, but oftentimes does not. The families of children who live in poverty are struggling to put food on the table, to find transportation, to work maybe 1 or 2 jobs. And the stresses of those make it nearly impossible for them to work with their children at home. That's why we have Head Start. Head Start provides developmental screening. So if they are low in an area, we can provide services for them, and in some instances will be at grade level by the time they leave Head Start, which means they're ready to learn when they get to kindergarten. If they don't have a medical home, we connect them. If they don't have a dental home, we connect them. We provide 1/3 of their nutritional needs each day so that their brains are getting fed the food that they need so that they can learn. The opportunity to have Head Start is really important because without it, those children would not succeed, and they will drop out of school, not graduate, and a lot of times wind up in the services of the jail. So we don't want that to happen. But in addition to that, Head Start also works with the families to teach them about making goals, to how important they are to teach their children, how they can do that, and also connect them positively with the elementary school so the transition between Head Start and the elementary school is very smooth. So what I worry about now that the wage of our families are going up, now that the minimum wage is increasing, we have fewer families that are available that can be part of Head Start. So that means that programs that used to have 700 and 800 on their waiting list now have maybe 200. Some programs are just going day by day on the waiting list. They don't have enough kids. So we are getting close to that 100% level that we wanted to achieve for kids being in Head Start, as long as the poverty level is rising in Head Start. If it lowers again, then we have a lot more kids that are available for Head Start. But I worry about the kids that are above that poverty level that now have access to nothing and their parents still cannot afford preschool. At 101% of poverty, you still are living in poverty at some level. So that's why we need to think about that gap that is in there, that barrier that's there. But Head Start really provides a service that I think is critical to the future of our kids. And I am really very proud to be part of it.
Thank you. Okay, great. For our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Rahi Reddy, Diversity and Equity Inclusion Program Director at Metro. With me today are Andrea Peluso, the co-founder and executive director of Family Forward Oregon, Carmen Rubio, the executive director of Latino Network, and Donna Schnittker, president and director at large at the Oregon Head Start Association. So I think one of the biggest questions that families, parents, what we talk about around the dinner table is really this question of why are costs so high for childcare when we know that our wonderful providers and preschool teachers that we know are making such low wages, many of whom can't find housing, are constantly moving. Can you answer this question? Why is this, and this is an issue even before Oregon raised its minimum wage, and which was an incredible victory for working families all over the state. This was an issue before then. So what's happening in our economy that this really, it's a contradiction, isn't it?
Quality costs money. So we want our kids to be in settings where they're safe, where there's an adequate number of adults for the number of children, where the facility that they're in is up to code, where they're near green spaces. Like there are conditions that are known to provide good quality environments to kids, whether that's in a center, in a home-based facility, with a friend or family member. And those things require investment. Those things have costs. So we have a lot of rules around how childcare facilities operate, and those are passed with good intention. Like those rules exist because we want our kids to have good care. And that makes care more expensive. And that is why, again, I kind of point back to the system will not thrive as it is. Just like we made a decision at some point in our country's history that we were going to invest in public universal education, we need to make the same decision about publicly funded universal childcare. It's the same need, it's the same kids. We see the same things around what you have to invest to get the quality outcomes that you want and need. These aren't systems that can be mechanized. They're not systems that can operate in a highly efficient manner. These are humans we're talking about. And their focus needs to be somewhat individualized, and that costs resources.
Donna, are you wanting to chime in here?
Yes. I think that we don't understand what it takes for infrastructure to get up and running for a child care program. Then you have to have staff that has a certain amount of training, and that costs money too for the staff, but you have to pay them a little bit more, even though you can't pay them what they really deserve. And it's just like a snowball effect. You want quality child care, but people will leave your situation to go somewhere else because they can make more money, and they have to keep their family moving forward, so that makes total sense. I know that one of the things that Head Start's working on right now is bumping our salaries up. They have to have a bachelor's degree and enough courses in early childhood to equal a major. That costs money on the staff's part or the program's part. We get them trained up and they're working for us, and the school district comes along and has a job and just snaps them right away. So we start over again. And it's sad that someone who really loves the little kids and wants to stay in early childhood has to leave because the wages are so low that they need to go somewhere else to make more money to support their family, especially if you're a single mom.
And in terms of, we know that there's incredible greater need as we think about the changing demographics in Oregon. And yesterday I had the excellent privilege of taking a tour of Cairo's PDX school, which is a school really created to focus on a culturally specific approach to teaching children, Black children, and children of color. And there's incredible intentionality and work and training involved in really building the kind of learning environment that kids need to thrive. So I was curious, with the changing demographics of Oregon and I assume different needs and different levels of expertise, how do these programs get funded, and what's the future of that in this kind of model we have now of struggling around paying for care?
I'm glad you had a chance to visit Kairos. It's a beautiful program, and it's a wonderful example of when a community comes together to really resource and get behind an education program that best serves the most underserved in our community. And what I would say to that is, the result of what we have right now, we're ranked pretty among the last in our graduation rates among the country. I think it's at, we have a 74% graduation rate, and it's even, of course, lower for communities of color, in the 50th and 60th percentiles for Black, African American, Latino, and Native students. So we have a lot of work to do, and this, in combination with many other factors, really tells us that we really need a statewide strategy for learning and closing this opportunity gap, and there's a lot of urgency. How we have done that ourselves, I'll just tell you the story where we first attempted by community-based solutions, coming together in community, trying to get resource through grants and contracts, fundraising, but really over time we realized the need is so incredibly great, and we were so fortunate, and in this community we're very fortunate to have the Portland Children's Levy, which is a unique model, and even they will admit that they are under-resourced to meet the true existing need that out there to resource early learning programs and all education programs, in fact. So we decided this last session to go upstream, and so we worked together with education stakeholders and early learning stakeholders to come up with a bill that would really address this specific gap about programs and excellent strategies and programs that resource underserved communities, programs in early learning. And that was a bill that was in this session. We had a lot of broad bipartisan support. We weren't successful this session, but it has really amped us up for next session. And I think that is a key learning that we took as a community-based organization, that we have to go upstream. We have to arm ourselves with, in coalition with other organizations who have the same aligned interests, and really advocate and ask our representative leaders to represent all of us. And that means resourcing appropriately to close that gap.
Do other folks want to? In Head Start, I imagine in the programming you do across the state, I was wondering, in terms of the approaches, what resources do you get to be able to change curriculum or to have those, kind of cultural approaches?
I think in the metro area, like in Multnomah, Washington counties up here in particular, there are programs that have 27 to 29 different cultures in their program, some that many in a classroom, well, up to 20 in a classroom. And our staff have been really creative in how to reach those families and the children with the type of education that they need to be successful in school. But it's a huge challenge. Can you imagine having a classroom with children who come from so many different cultures and have so many different languages, and yet you need to teach them, and our teachers have figured out how to do it. And I think it's just so amazing. But that needs to happen statewide in a variety of settings. I think we can't just stop in one place and say that's the way it is. We need to look at it broadly to say, how do we serve these children who come from different cultures and have different languages in a way that makes them successful when they hit kindergarten and their future education as they go on and graduate from high school?
I think when I say that we need the kind of big public system on childcare, I think sometimes people go to this place of thinking what we mean is a bunch of similar centers, like that there's these kind of government-sponsored childcare centers. And I want to be clear, I think a system that really acknowledges our shared values, really reaching impacted communities, being culturally competent and specific, means designing something much more creative than that. It means that we need to be able to have a system that reflects the different types of needs that parents have, who work all hours of the day and night now, who work weekends, who have irregular schedules. It means not just prioritizing care in a specific setting. It can't just be care in a center. We also need to figure out how we fund care in our homes, care in our family members' homes. That for many people, that's going to be the best kind of care that will be in language and culturally competent and in line with their values and what they want for their kids. So we need to be reflective about how we're developing these systems so that they're really reaching everyone and being able to reflect the really rich diversity of what we value. I would say, too, the other thing I wanted to give a plug for is we commissioned this report, which Rahi was a co-author of, called Oregon's Care Economy last year, the case for public care investment. And you can find it on our website, which is familyforward.org. And it really digs into some of these questions about both shifting demographics, shifting workforce, that actually the fields of the future are in care, to do with kids and then more and more working parents, but also to do with our aging population, and that these are fields we can't outsource elsewhere. They really can't be mechanized. Like these are the industries of the future. And we can either decide that those industries are exploitive and not fueling our larger economy, or we can decide to invest in those being really high quality jobs that feed back into our local economies. And we're at a junction right now where I think we really have to decide if we're going to build the level of infrastructure and support that these systems really need to fuel broader economic development.
So I guess the other question I often hear is, when we're in the schools and when we're in the classrooms and there's incredible diversity and cultures and different types of families, that really our system of both caregiving and childcare and education really aren't keeping up with all of the changes of the demographics and the changes in families. And I wanted to just, I was curious what your impression is. Is there a disconnect from our policy making from the realities of the kitchen table and what's happening in families right now?
That is probably true, because the kitchen table solves problems and the policies don't always, and it takes a long time to make them happen. I think we need to, as a state, look at what our demographics are and what the needs are, and then start targeting our resources in those directions so that our families and our children can be successful. And I'm not sure that we're there. Just like in a Head Start classroom with 20 different, dialects or languages and cultures, how do you meet the needs of those children, and help them to be successful? We need to look at it possibly in a different way, and can't right now.
I would say resoundingly yes, and I think this isn't just about a rapidly diversifying student and family population. It's about the need for institutions that are really outdated. They're ill-equipped right now to really meet the needs of students and families of today. And when you think about our systems of education, they're really built for a different looking family. They weren't built for families that look like my family or many of the families that we serve. And so we really need an investment that's not just about also about approach, but also about workforce. We really need a prepared workforce that really knows how to work with our families, that is reflective of the families that are served, and then you'll start to see some tremendous gains.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said earlier, I think that our structures are really designed with almost none of our families in mind, actually. They still perceive of this family where there's someone who's available all the time to care for a family, and that there's some other person who's available all the time to work. And work is designed that way. Everything around work is designed that way. And that's just not true for the vast majority of families now. It's really, I think, fewer than 20% that have that model of a full-time breadwinner and a full-time caretaker. And so everything has to change to really center those families and those demands and those needs differently. And our institutions aren't evolving rapidly enough. And frankly, like the people responsible for making them evolve aren't necessarily the ones facing the kinds of consequences that we're facing on a daily basis, which I think is part of why that work is invisible. We're solving it individually in our homes, at our kitchen tables. We're not solving it collectively. And that's a problem because it's something we all experience. And I think when we work a lot with moms, and a lot of the first conversations we have are about, this isn't just you struggling. This isn't you failing. This isn't you having made the wrong decisions. This is a system that's designed to get the outcomes it's getting. And it's not getting great outcomes for many of us. And that's not my individual fault. And when I speak sometimes to policymakers, I hear things like, well, those women should have just done all these things differently, and that might have set them up for more success. Instead of, this is a systemic problem. When motherhood by itself is a predictor of poverty, then this is a bigger problem than me and the choices that I'm making. This is us not investing properly in the things that would support my family.
In our last 5 minutes, wanted to ask, bright spots. Are there models? Are there places that you look to really say, we should try to do this in Oregon?
Well, I think one of the bright spots that is coming up now is with the new performance standards that came out last year. They're giving programs an option of extended day services, which will now meet the needs of some families in certain areas. So I think that Head Start now will be giving, it's preschool with childcare sort of thrown in there, but longer days so families don't have to worry about transporting them from partial day to childcare. It'll be a more seamless service. I think that's a bright spot.
I would say I appreciate the question, and because it brings up a point for us about we often look outside to other examples for bright, shining examples of what we should do in Oregon. And I think that what we probably should do is look internally and look at the bright spots that are here in Oregon across the state. We have excellent examples of high-performing programs, high-performing institutions that really are valuing and doing it right and getting it right by working with families as they are right now today. Workplaces that allow you to bring your children. I see little ones here, which is awesome. We do the same at our workplace. But things that can be more adaptive and creative, things that are blooming from the community up and outward. We need to look at those gems in our own backyard.
Yeah, I mean, I would say with relationship to programs around care and paid family and medical leave and childcare, these are not new concepts. The US is very far behind every other rich nation in the world, and many not so rich nations. There are lots of bright spots. This is not a new area of policy. We know all the things that work. We just haven't done them. And to Carmen's point, I think Oregon needs to be a bright spot. Oregon needs to lead the way on some of these things, and the country will follow. But we have an obligation here to come up with some good ideas and to advance some of these things and to test them and to make models for places where this is much more challenging to do.
Great, thank you. Andrea Peluso, co-founder and executive director of Family Forward Oregon, Carmen Rubio, executive director of Latino Network, and Donna Schnecker, president and director at large at the Oregon Head Start Association. Let's now go to the audience for some questions. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for staff to collect. Okay, high, up, okay. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. For City Club members who'd like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Kurt Wavering, member. You were saying that money is a key to this. And in the United States, states and localities provide publicly funded education and require children to go to school. So we're talking about preschool kids. Are there countries in Europe that have programs where they use state or local funding to provide the kinds of programs that you're proposing?
Andrea Peluso?
Yes, the answer is yes. And those models may vary, but in many places, preschool is built into our public education system. So it actually starts at 3. In some places, there are more, like public schools, more public entities that provide universal pre-K. And in fact, there are models of that in this country, and a growing number of them in cities, in some counties, and in some states.
Could you be more specific? Are we talking about Sweden, Germany, UK, India?
Yes, and each of those varies, but nearly all of them has some version of preschool education that is either directly operating out of a public school setting or is a 3-4 setting separate for preschool kids. And in fact, most of those also have some version of publicly funded childcare for kids 0 to 3 as well. And that can look like a subsidy model like what we have, where parents or providers are directly reimbursed. It can look like a publicly sponsored center that more resembles a public school. There are a lot of different models for us to contemplate as we start thinking about what we're trying to build.
In some of the research that we did on the Oregon Care Economy Report, we looked at a study with the U.S. military. In the U.S. military, if you live on these bases, there's actually subsidized care and programming directly for service members. And another case study we looked in right here in North America and Canada. So the province of Quebec has a $10 a day universal childcare fund. So every family up to the age of 13 just pays $10 a day to support childcare, and everyone has access to it. So it's some interesting models. Thank you. Next question.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. Recently, there was a proposal for funding paid family leave from an unlikely source, Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who has proposed allowing a certain number of months of access to payment from the Social Security system with a postponement of the access of that worker to commence their regular Social Security benefit then at the end of their career by the same number of months. Reactions?
My reaction to that is not positive. And the reason is because women are already penalized in retirement for their caregiving roles. So what we know from the data, and let's be real about who takes leave right now, and I would like to say that part of what will change the world is not just for women to lean in, which was a big thing a couple years ago, but for more men to lean out and start taking care of family outside of work too. But right now, given the reality of the way things operate, women see penalties in their wages, in their access to the kinds of jobs that help you save for retirement, in the way they accrue Social Security throughout their working lives as a result of their caregiving responsibilities. So the idea that to finance that time, we would have to further penalize ourselves in old age feels unfair. We know in Oregon that among the poorest quartile of retirees, 80% of them are women. The reality in this country is that women are aging into poverty, and us delaying our access to this social good creates more inequity, not less.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Question just about the scale of the financial commitment that would be necessary in order to carry this off at a national level. Congress just passed a $1 trillion tax cut for corporations. For $1 trillion over 10 years, could you ensure quality, affordable child care for every child in America?
Pretty sure the answer is yes to that. We've priced out what some much bigger models of public spending in Oregon would look like, and not even to get to the universal scale. And I think we're talking about billions of dollars, right? So trillion to me looks like it could divide really well across 50 states. We could certainly do a lot with that kind of money.
Ted Kay, City Club member. I've heard you advance various things, various proposals, and your arguments for them are mostly on the emotive scale. I'd like you to advance the economic arguments for these investments or this spending.
I can give you some. Head Start has done research, and also Fight Crime Invest in Kids has also done some research, that for every dollar that you invest in early learning, you save $7 by the time they get to high school. So I would say that's a significant savings for investing in early learning.
So I'd like to go to a question that was submitted. Oh, why don't you go ahead? You go ahead. Yeah. Yes, at the
Is it to
podium.
me?
Yes, at the podium.
A question about Hispanics and Spanish dual language immersion programs in the state. We have a report out of Portland Public Schools that kids in dual language immersion programs after 8th grade are about a year ahead of English reading over their people who didn't get into the programs. And yet we have, I guess, 23% set of students in K-12 are Hispanics, and no more than 5% of students are in Spanish immersion programs statewide. So there's a big gap there for Hispanic students, and I'm wondering if that goes down to the preschool age. And part of the problems is we just don't have the teachers, and that's sort of our system of higher education produces mainly white teachers, monolingual teachers. Thank you.
Go ahead, Carmen.
So I agree with you. We're huge proponents of dual language immersion programs. I think the problem is we're not resourced enough to provide that access to that program on a larger scale. I know that also there's accessibility issues, there's resource issues, but there's also parents also don't have enough information sometimes to understand that their child might benefit from these programs. Oftentimes there might be confusion about ESL programs and how that is distinguished from dual language immersion. So there is some education to do with parents about that distinction as well. I'd also like to kind of address the teacher issue, which is also, I think, a workforce issue like we suggested. We do have teachers in this community. It's really up to local institutions, local districts to figure out how they advance an ethic and a commitment to workforce diversity within their district. We have several districts around the state. Always there's not enough, but some folks are getting it right.
And how are these programs, how are they funded? So some of the programs that you mentioned, I don't think people, it was one of the questions here, but how are they funded in the state?
Dual language immersion?
Oh, no, some of the programs that you mentioned earlier that work with children, early childhood education, some of the programs that you said are kind of really good models that...
Yes, those are funded various ways. A lot of them, majority are funded by excellent, foundations who recognize the importance. We also have partnerships with school districts that understand and look at the high outcomes of these programs, and they co-invest with community-based organizations who have demonstrated outcomes around this work. And more recently, which is what we're trying to do at the state level with this last bill, 4066, is trying to go upstream and get the state to invest in these innovative programs to scale across the state, so that we have, so local communities have multiple tools, have many different ways of accessing under-resourced communities.
And one question that we got from the audience is, can you tell us about some of the programs here in Oregon that are working with families and are kind of being responsive to this reality that most parents of young children are working parents? And I know, Donna, you had mentioned one program that was a bright spot for you, but it seems like a pretty big disconnect in our state, and I was just wondering if others or you had more examples.
I know that if you're living in poverty, but oftentimes you are not working, our families aren't, but we have a lot of families who are working now in Head Start. And the reality is that we have to think about things differently. Head Start requires 2 home visits minimally every year by a social service person, and 2 home visits by the teacher, which is separate, so that's 4 home visits. If they're working, then Head Start staff have to think differently about how that's accomplished. And it creates a whole different way of viewing how things happen. So our staff sometimes have to work longer hours to accomplish the goals that have been set forth, or you have to think about it creatively.
So connected to the long hours and the wages, we touched upon this a little bit, and one of our audience members asked the question of, you know, in terms of, we know the wages are low, we know that this is a difficult field to work in, and that turnover is high, and the question is, what would attract folks to actually come into this field? And in particular, as we look at the changing demographics, and we want more people of color and workers of color to join the sector, do they have to wait till we fix everything? Because the challenges are so high, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I don't think we have to wait until it's fixed, and I think we're trying to do things to make it better. But research has shown that an educator that has a bachelor's degree has greater outcomes than a preschool teacher that doesn't. So they require that Head Start teachers have a bachelor's degree. That requires that people get a college education. They have debt, so they need to make money to pay back that debt. So if you work for a Head Start program, sometimes you can get your school loans forgiven. That is one incentive to come and work for Head Start. And I think that if you have a college degree, there's an assumption that you would be paid a higher wage. And you come and look at childcare and in Head Start, other preschool programs, you do not, because they can't afford to pay you the wages. So that is one thing we have to figure out. I know that we are asking, Head Start teachers make an average of $28,000. A kindergarten teacher makes an average of $63,000. There's a huge gap there. So if a kindergarten job or an elementary school job comes open and one of the Head Start staff is qualified, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to go to the school district because they're going to make $40,000 more. So why wouldn't you? And I think we have to really evaluate. I guess at the heart of it, I don't think our society recognizes that child care providers and preschool teachers are professional people. It's a professional job. They are taking care of our most cherished product that we have in our state, which is our children. And yet, no one values the work that they do enough to pay them a wage that we want them to stay there. And I think that is the key to everything. And if you're a single parent, or even if it's a family, you still want to make a wage that allows your family to succeed. And that requires that you get an income that is actually good for you and your family. And you'll search for it. And if it comes your way, you'll take it. And that is not good for our workforce in early learning.
I look at it a little bit different way, which is actually, so these industries, and again, back to this report I shared, are dominantly women. I mean, like 90%, like not just a little bit, majority. And they already have a lot of, like, disproportionately women of color working in these fields. And I think we could look at it another way and say that part of the reason that the jobs are so low paid is because of who's doing the work. And that the reality is that we really need to lift wages to the question that someone asked about kind of putting some numbers behind this, because we know that investments in those wages impacts those women's families and the economies in which they operate, and that we really need to lift the wages in those jobs because of who's doing the jobs. And we also have to think a little bit more broadly about what outcomes we're measuring for. I think in this system we've thought a lot about educational outcomes, which is great, but that's only one piece of what is a much larger set of outcomes that I think we need to think about. That might push us in one direction. So like if we think about educational outcomes, we might prioritize more center-based care than the kind of familial care that we also need to support that has other kinds of outcomes. You know, what kind of outcome comes from being in a place where the care provider is your family member who really loves you and knows you well and knows your family? We haven't yet figured out how to measure for that kind of quality, and what those kinds of investments should look like.
Hi, this is Bobby Regan. I'm a City Club member. As a former K-12 school board member, we know that the student achievement gap starts way before children walk through the door. The student achievement gap being the difference in educational achievement between our white majority kids and our students of color. So I'm excited, Carmen, that Latino Network is asking for a stronger investment by our state. The question I have is, what responsibility do today's corporations and employers have to lean in and to help subsidize when it comes to childcare and early education? What are the benefits to them of doing so? And are there any good examples here in Oregon of companies that are leaning in?
Thank you. I want to thank you for being such a big supporter of our early learning programs while you were at Portland Public Schools, so thank you, Bobby. I agree with you that there isn't as much interest as we would like by corporations locally taking an interest. There seems to be a lot of support for K-12 programs, and no one can dispute the need for that. I think, though, there is as we do more education and as early childhood becomes more prevalent on the statewide stage, public policy stage, there is more discussion and there are some opportunities for education. So we've seen an increase in corporations locally who are starting to learn more about our programs and be interested in funding and supporting our programs. Umpqua Bank is one who has made a long-term commitment to our program in particular, as well as I'm trying to think of some other folks. I'm blanking out right now, but we definitely have some interest, and it's hopeful. I think All Hands Raised is also doing a great job of bringing the corporate leaders in this local community to the table, where we can lift up some bright spots in early learning and do some education there as well.
I do know that there's one program in Portland area, Nike Corporation, that has its own preschool and daycare associated with the company. And it's based, Head Start directors have moved over and are leading the program. I've been on tour there. I don't see a lot of diversity, but I think they set an example of what can happen to stabilize their own workforce, give parents peace of mind. And when you can't find childcare, you can't go to work. And when you have it right there on site, it makes it so much easier and you feel so much more comfortable about leaving your child, which gives you a stable workforce.
Our time is up, and unfortunately we need to pause the discussion for now, but we hope this is the beginning of even more in-depth conversations about this topic for each of you. Please join me in thanking our panel for being here today, and I'd also like to say a special thank you to Emerald Bogue and Andrew Kallick, the producers of the program. We appreciate all the hard work that went in today to making today possible. Thank you.